What does it look like to allow Jesus to open our eyes so we can see people like He sees people? Welcome to Theology Sabbath School, a ministry of the School of Theology on the campus of Walla Walla University. I'm Carl Cosart, the Dean of the School of Theology and the host of Theology Sabbath School. This week we're continuing in our lesson study, Making Friends for Jesus, the joy of sharing in His message, by looking at week 3. And week 3 focuses on how we should view and see other people. And to help me in this week's lesson, I've invited a colleague of mine, Dr. Jody Washburn, an associate professor here in Old Testament, and she'll be the main teacher to kind of walk us through this lesson. So Dr. Washburn, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us here for Sabbath School this week. You know, our lesson starts off with really a fascinating story. It's a story found in the Gospel of Mark, Mark chapter 8. If you have your Bibles, I invite you to turn there. It's Mark chapter 8, verse 20 through 26. And it's the story of Jesus as He goes around, He's healing, and He comes to the city of Bethsaida. And this is really an unusual miracle because they bring a blind man to Jesus, and Jesus spits in the man's eyes and He goes to heal the man. But what's really strange about it is besides the spitting in his eye, right? That doesn't always sound like the best way to start, a way to help someone, but this is associated with different ideas at that time. And it says that He spit on his eyes, laid His hands on him, and He asks him this question, "Do you see anything?" And it says he looked up and he said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." So the initial phase 1 of this miracle is not perfect eyesight. He sees things only unclearly. And then we're told Jesus laid His hands on his eyes again, and He opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And then Jesus sent him home. So Dr. Washburn, I don't know about you, but this has always surprised me, because you would think that the power of Jesus to heal would be sufficient for Him simply to allow this man to see perfectly the first time. I don't know about you. Have you thought about perhaps, and I have some ideas, but have you thought about why it takes 2 phases of this initial healing miracle in order for this man's eyes to truly see?
Yeah, that's a good question. I tend to see it, as I see a lot of stories and narratives in the biblical text, as sort of a testimony to process. So I could give a personal example. I remember the many, countless times I would run in a panic to my advisor's office during grad school and, try to express to him that there was just no way I just can't do it, and I'm writing this paper, but it's not going to be good. And, I would go down this thing thinking in my mind that the ultimate purpose that I was there for could not be met unless this particular step was perfect. And over, he would just he just wouldn't go there with me. Like, he didn't come right out and say it, but he just would remind me in subtle ways that it doesn't matter the step as much as the participation, and that you go in this process, and that you can't discount a step because it's not a full realization, perhaps, of the ultimate goal. And we intuitively know this when we look at children, right? We don't look at a little child who is developing and say, "Oh, this is like incomplete, and if I was a good parent, I would have just birthed you whole already," right? Fully mature and ready to set off into independence. But in our spiritual lives, or when we talk about God, for some reason we're a bit uncomfortable with that process element. And yet throughout the biblical text, we have this repeated demonstration that God is not concerned. He lets people go hundreds of years with misunderstandings about His character or about the purpose of what is going on in the story of the people, and it doesn't seem to bother God. There's a process that people are invited to participate in So I see that same thing in this story. Like, it's okay. The process is okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it is true. There is this process, and I like this idea of thinking, that we kind of had this expectation sometimes that we should birth a fully grown child, but that's not reality. There is a process, and in this story, I think it really highlights the nature of Jesus' ministry. In fact, if you look earlier in this chapter in Mark 8, in verse 18 or so, Jesus is talking to the disciples, and he talks to them in connection to the Pharisees. And he says, "Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but you do not see, and ears but do not hear?" And this is where we actually find the disciples. They're just like the Pharisees in the sense, they're further along the path, right? The process is further along. They've recognized the power and the authority of Jesus, but they right now have no clue about what the nature of his ministry is all about. And so the healing of this blind man in this two-stage, right, this process healing, shows that even when we come to Jesus, that we don't always, it changes our vision, but we don't see things always like we are called ultimately to see things. And it takes a second process, a second healing touch from Jesus in order for us to be able to see things more clearly. And probably the reality is, right, that I need that touch more than twice. I think I probably need it on a daily basis to be able to see things through the eyes of Jesus. In fact, that reminds me of a passage that the Apostle Paul makes in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 18, where he has this prayer that he prays for the Ephesians, and he comes to God on their behalf, petitioning, and he asks for an interesting request. He says, "I pray the eyes of your heart may be opened." And what's interesting here is we actually have what we would call a mixed metaphor, right? That the eyes will be open, but it's not the eyes in their head, but the eyes of their heart. I'm curious, in your work with background studies, do you have any idea about the nature of a mixed metaphor like this and what really might be maybe culturally ideas behind it that might give this passage a little more clarity for us?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about like mixed metaphor. I tend to think of them as, think of going through a day, right? And often we're on autopilot. So we just go from step to step, and we're going based on what we expect, and it's coming. So we're not sort of fully attentive. And then if something comes that we don't expect, suddenly it jerks our attention. We suddenly have this like full focus, and we are like sort of, we're aware, right, of the thoughts and the assumptions and the decisions that we're making. And when I think of mixed metaphor, I think it kind of does that for us, right? When you read, for instance, God is a rock, right? Suddenly you have to stop and think, okay, well, what am I going to do with that? And this one is even more jarring, I would say, because eyes are how we perceive the world. And I mean, if it comes right down to it, it's just, what's that? The Bible also has this phrase, right? That the eye is the light, right? Which really, that could be a scientist saying that. The eye is this organ that then allows light to come in, and through that we perceive everything around us. And so it seems like that in this prayer, in this phrase that has been turned into song lyrics that have been sung by millions of people, and it's turned into lines in poetry. I mean, this mixed metaphor of opening the eyes of the heart has been picked up because it takes our confirmed human experience at both levels. So just the simple, we open our eyes, and if our eyes are healthy, then we see, right? It allows us to see. But then it combines that with this sense that we experience other people and ourselves and God and the world around us through our heart, through our broader body, right? Not just our eyes and the signals that they're sending, the synapses in our brain. So to me, it allows us to draw on all of those connotations of the two kind of separate pictures. And then the fact that, like, if we go back to this, right, that Paul is praying that the eyes of their heart may be opened. So it's almost like a recognition that that whole process, right, is taken It's a gift of God, and also sort of accomplished through the Spirit of God active in that person's life. And if you want to back up a little more, I mean, I'm thinking of lots of texts in the Hebrew Bible where there's a connotation of opening, and I think we see this in Ephesians, but because if you read in other translations, that verse in Ephesians uses the word light. So enlighten the minds, enlighten the hearts of the people. But in the Hebrew Bible, often this sense of light, so God giving you light, it's used in the sense of wisdom and insight and discernment. So for instance, many times, you can think in terms of, you can see this in Isaiah 58 in the prophetic poem. You can see it in Psalms, specifically Psalms about God's law and how God's law can like show us the way forward. It's used almost in parallel with righteousness and wisdom and understanding. And all those things are understood as ultimately coming from God, but like God is enlightening, right? God is providing that discernment for each moment, each interaction we might be having with another person, our reflections about God, what it means to become more like Jesus, right? The idea that the power behind that is part of this divine source and sustainer understanding of God as the creator that we see in the Bible, but that we somehow partake in that and gain, right, understanding. And I think also inherent in that, so not just the idea that enlightening the eyes of the heart means like wisdom, but in that there's also an element of what you mentioned earlier about, you know, needing more than one healing. We would need Jesus to open our eyes over and over, right? Not just in a two-phase thing, but maybe this is a constant part of reality as a Christian, that you return again and again to Jesus and ask for that work to be done, right? And this is the same connotation, that understanding comes from God's continued guiding and giving us discernment.
I think we really see that here too. I think we really see that here too, because what's interesting is Paul is actually writing not to unbelievers but to believers. And so here, case in point again, that there's process, right? He's asking, and this is a letter probably written later in his life, probably during his Roman imprisonment perhaps. And so this church has been established for a long time, but he's still praying that these people will see in a different way. And I really like the imagery you just mentioned too, because there is this idea that light allows us to see, right? As you mentioned, God's word is it a lamp to my feet or a light to my path? And certainly, I hate to say this, but I recognize more and more, for me to be able to see how much in my older age I need light, right? If it's dark, I can't see it. I need light to be able to see clearly. And in that sense, I think, don't we get this idea in the Bible that we kind of dwell in darkness, right? Darkness is what kind of naturally surrounds us. We don't see things like we really should see, and God really is the only one who can give us that true 2020 vision. Maybe I can just share a little story here. Several years ago, it's been a long time, I had some people who came to see me, and so I sit down with them, and they were concerned about some of the things that were happening on the campus of Walla Walla University. And it was actually an edition of our campus paper, The Collegian, which is often a hot spot since it's a student-produced paper, and students will always have challenging ideas, and it sometimes can be unsettling for some in the more widespread community when they interact with these ideas. But what they were concerned about was, I think it was the front page or the sports page of the Collegian. They pulled it out and they asked honestly, these are serious people, faithful Christians, and they asked this question, what do you see in this picture? And I looked down, and it was a picture of the girls volleyball team. Now, if you know girls volleyball, the outfits that they wear are sometimes not the longest. They're tight, close-fitting. And I knew what they were asking was basically they wanted me to say, yes, this is outrageous, it's scandalous. How can they show, these scantily clad, girls playing volleyball? But when I looked at the picture, what I saw was actually a girl that I had in class. And this girl had shared her story, her challenge of struggling with faith, the difficult family background that she had come out of, and the struggles in that, and concerns about her family, concerns about her siblings. And so I knew that this girl that was on this cover, I knew where her heart was. And so when they asked me, what do I see? I said, well, I see a girl that I had in class, and this girl, I went and shared some of her story in a non-revealing way, right? I shared some of her story, and I didn't say what they wanted me to say, which was, yeah, I see these scantily clad, college girls. And to me, that kind of illustrates how it is that we need to see that oftentimes what we see is not really, it's not what God sees, right? He sees behind the face mask, right? He sees behind ethnicity. He sees behind all these different barriers that we place. Our vision is often, and I could honestly say it's not like somehow that I'm righteous, right? Because in this story, because I saw this girl, but I'm guilty of the same thing, right? It's so easy for me to see other things than to see what really God wants me to see. So I think that's a lesson for all of us in that sense. And in fact, if we go back to the title of today's lesson, which is Seeing People Through the Eyes of Jesus, there are some other words there besides just seeing, right? Maybe we can talk about that for just a few minutes.
Yeah, seeing people through Jesus' eyes. There's so much there. I guess there's the people phrase, which we might pass over and be thinking, well, of course we're seeing people. But it's interesting to me as I've read various thinkers and people who have articulated, for instance, philosophy of religion or sort of sociological concepts, that there's a big distinction people make between ways that humans look at other people as objects and ways that people look at other people, like as equally human. So we can, for instance, easily look at another human and just see them in terms of instrumentality, or like what they're going to do for us. So are they going to somehow benefit me, right? And that in and of itself is not a bad thing, right? It's part of we have to be able to make those predictions to live well. But it's sometimes useful to stop and stop ourselves and really think, like, am I thinking of this person as someone who is just an object to be used or to be controlled? I'm trying to think of examples. Often in Christian community, I think I've experienced I have felt like I have been perceived more as a person who is being used by another person to protect that person or that entity or organization's reputation, for instance, right? And that's dehumanizing, to think I'm just here to sort of support the perception of this person's reputation or this organization, and there's not as much interest in me, like all the complexities that make me, right? My story, my personality, the things that just bring me great delight, the things that bring me great sorrow. And this is a huge conversation in broader, thought circles, and I think it's worthwhile to notice, this is not just seeing everything. So which I think is a worthwhile thing to think about, seeing everything through God's eyes, learning to sort of back away and be aware of our perceptions and the lenses that we bring, and try to open ourselves to growth. But yeah, I think it's important that we think of people and we don't just say, well, of course I see people as people, because we often see people as objects or as means to an end, and that in itself is not a God's eye view, I guess.
I mean, in one sense, I guess you might say we're consumers, right? So we see the world for what we can get out of it. We see people, what we can get out of them. We see them as dollar signs. We see them as, things that they can do for us. And I guess I learned that a little bit more when I was a pastor. And I'm a cleric, so I have kind of this, get it done mode. That's the mode I like to operate in. But so my apologies to everyone here in our apartment for that. But that's kind of my nature. And as a pastor, I had to learn that I had to recognize that it wasn't necessarily the doing that was important. I mean, doing is important, but as much as the relationships that, taking time at the beginning of a meeting to talk about life issues people are going through. And not just as a way to get to the real work, but as the work itself, right? To consider what people are going through. Because when you understand their background, all of a sudden your perspective changes, right? You look at their struggles, their challenges, their hopes, their dreams, and it becomes a whole different situation. And I think, for me, I have to always remind myself, right? It's not just about getting something done, it's about the process. And I think that's what we see here, and the importance, I think, in this week's lesson.
Yeah, there's another part to the sort of line too, because not only do we have to always check ourselves and just be aware, like, am I starting to go towards seeing this person as a means to an end, or am I really like connecting, right? Mutual relationship, like we see in the covenant in the Hebrew Bible. But there's also the sort of acknowledgement or recognition that we are not God. I mean, that's pretty basic. I think intellectually we would all perhaps assent to that. Anyone listening today probably believes in God and maybe has this sense of an understanding that, God, there's the Creator God, and I am not Him, right? But there's another sense in which, because we experience everyone, we experience the world around us, people, we experience our understanding encounters with God, all of it through our perception, right? Going back to that sort of, what is our brain doing when we see someone, when we talk to someone, when we hear something? There's a level in which we experience everything through our perception, and it can be really easy to start to equate the two, to think that my perception and my experience is a complete thing that therefore is the same as God's. And we see this all the time. I mean, what's the standard joke in theology, right? Is like, the God you're describing is sounding an awfully lot like you, right? but we can joke about it, but there's also a sense in which it's something for us to be aware of, So I think that whole phrase, the seeing people through Jesus' eyes, there are things for us to reflect on in each word or part of that phrase.
This passage reminds me of another passage, and it's kind of funny because we tend to run to our areas of comfort. So I noticed earlier, we started in Ephesians, but you ran to the Old Testament. So I'm going to run back to the New Testament now. But 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul has this great passage, starting with verse 16. He says, "From now on, therefore, we regard no one according to the flesh, even though we once regarded Christ according to the flesh. We regard him thus no longer." So he says here, we're called not to regard people according to the flesh. I think this is this imagery of, right, for seeing them simply on a physical level. But Paul goes on to talk about that when Christ died, he reconciled the world to himself, and that we're called to be ambassadors. We're called to help reconcile people. And here is this call for us, right, to have the eyes of our hearts opened, to be able to see people as Jesus sees people. And that's what I would hope, right, that people, when they see my children, when they see eventually my grandchildren, my family, my parents, that they would see them through the eyes of Jesus and recognize that, we're all in need of God's redemption, and to be treated with love, consideration, and care. I think that really is at the heart of the Christian message. And I suppose we probably see this in other stories, and maybe there are some stories we should look at afresh, right, to kind of put on these spectacles, you might say. And I think one of those stories we could talk about, and here I'm going to run to a New Testament story again, so I hope you can live with this and help me with this. But in John chapter 4, we have a story of Jesus going and speaking to a woman at a well. And maybe this has some Old Testament connections because it deals with Samaritans versus Jews. And Jesus comes and he asks this woman for water, and there's this whole story that takes place. I'm just curious if you might have some thoughts on that New Testament story.
How many times we can go back to a story that we think we know so well. I mean, I've been teaching this story for a few years now in my class, and we print it out real big with a big margin, and we just mark everything we notice, and we talk about Old Testament connections and the narrative flow and all of this. And in this lesson, with this heading, seeing other people through Jesus' eyes, I returned to the story and I saw something that I hadn't really noticed before. And that is that this story, if you look through and you look at the words that are recorded, of like spoken word, what I mean, I should say dialogue. The very first time Jesus speaks is making a request or articulating and owning his own need. And it's not a profound need. It's a very physical, in the moment need. Like he has been walking, he's now sitting here, probably in a place where it was rather dry and maybe he didn't have any more water that he had carried with him, right? And he's sitting there and he has this physical need. I am thirsty. And he demonstrates to us what it's like to acknowledge that need, to voice the need, and then to express that need in a request to someone with no control over how they're going to respond, right? There's no sense of, you can't guarantee whether this person will or will not give you water, respond to that need. And then also the sense in which Jesus expresses and owns this need in the presence of and directly to a person who would have been considered an outsider, someone totally other, right? She's a woman, she's part of the group of the Samaritans, which is, if you trace back the history, they're intermarried, there's religious mixing, there's all of these sort of signs that would have been considered elements of impurity or lack of holiness from the Jewish perspective at that time. So I just find it somehow beautiful. I mean, I have trouble owning my needs. I have trouble asking. I have trouble connecting at that level when I don't feel like I know what the answer is going to be. Like, it's okay if I know and I'm like, oh yeah, the person will say yes. Then I ask all the time. But if there's uncertainty, I have a really hard time kind of owning my need. And so I was looking at this story and I'm thinking, this is just a beautiful model that Jesus just goes right up and says, give me some water, give me something to drink. And I think part of the reason I find that so moving right now is that, in a sense, I have always heard this story sort of cited as a formula that we should follow. Like growing up, I read all these books about sort of winning souls, which now that terminology just sort of makes me really uncomfortable. Like, it's not a matter of winning and losing. It's more like, let's share this beauty, let's see together, let's pay attention, let's see what God can do in us, right? But that aside, I just remember hearing it used as a formula. Like, first you have to come up with something that will let you sort of break the ice, and then as soon as you get the person in, then you just like take them on this 5-step path and you tell them salvation, and then you're kind of like, your job's done, You've kind of pushed the conversation, and I've heard it so often formulaic like that, and I'm starting to look at these stories in a fresh way and just see it like Jesus is modeling human connection, that we allow ourselves to need other people, and in doing that, we also allow ourselves to be of support to other people, right? Wherever they are, mentally, physically, spiritually, and that's where these beautiful interactions take place. So I'm kind of, that's the thing that I saw in this story as I went back to it with this lens of seeing people through Jesus' eyes.
And it is interesting too, because I can identify, having pastored for 10 years, and oftentimes we do use scripture passages to become a formula, right? Which really becomes not about the person, but about a baptism. And they say, well, no, it's the same. But sometimes we still look at people, even in the church, right, as numbers, right? These are baptisms, it's attendance, it's my church is bigger, it's, my tithe, my offerings, the church offerings, all those things. And this story is interesting because it really has all these barriers in it that I think that we struggle with, right? Because you mentioned some of these, right? Jesus is a man, she's a female, so there's this gender issues that we have to work with. Or, ethnicity, the background, Jewish versus kind of partially Jewish. An unmarried woman, right, versus a married woman. Like all these struggles and challenges. And in the story, it's interesting because Jesus is trying to break through each of these barriers. And the woman she's the one that throws up the barriers, right? Like, well, why should you ask me, right? You're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan, or you're a prophet, so that changes her course of action. But Jesus is trying to take this conversation and move it from a literal level about real water to the spiritual life-giving water that Jesus can actually give. And he wants to take it from the physical level down to the spiritual level, and she is resisting the whole way. She's uncomfortable, right? Tries to change the subject on Jesus several times, and Jesus just really expresses a genuine interest in this woman. In fact, one of the most touching depictions I've seen of this is a recent film series that's out. If you haven't seen it, this is a pure advertisement right now. It's called The Chosen. It is a powerful retelling story. It's supposed to be multi-years. It's just the first season is out. But the last episode is this story. And when I watched it, it touched me. It brought this passage alive in such a powerful way of showing how Jesus was just intent on taking down all these barriers and loving this woman, connecting with this woman, and bringing her to him in act of faith. And that's, I think, the way that we're really called to see. And so this story, to me, is just really a beautiful and powerful story. We need to be able to see like Jesus sees. Dr. Washburn, it turns out that you've been participating in a seminar dealing with psychological science. And I'm just curious if you could tell us a little bit about this seminar, because this was a selective process. I know I was involved in helping you make a request to become part of this seminar. So congratulations on being part of it. You were supposed to be in California live, but I think you've done it via Zoom. Can you tell us a little bit about this conference that you've been able to participate in, and how this subject matter perhaps of psychological science might shed some light on this whole topic?
Is now where it's like the word that I used talking to a friend the other day was, I feel like those pictures that have been turned into memes where you're like, you open your mouth like this and you're like under Palouse Falls or Niagara Falls, right? And the information is just flooding over, and I'm only kind of catching, what my tiny little mouth can hold. But it's been fascinating. It's been fascinating to think about the presuppositions of these different fields like theology, philosophy, and psychology. And it's also been fascinating to just learn some more about how our brains work. Like the first presenter was a neuroscientist from Stanford University, and he just talked about where people are at in the research of like neuroscience, what's going on, right, physically in our brains, and then what kind of implications does that have for our discussions of free will and responsibility and these things that really matter in how we live our lives. So it's been a wonderful experience. And I guess the main, I'm just going to maybe share one thing that has really gotten me thinking, especially in terms of as I went through the lesson this week. It struck me how often we sort of, I don't know if dichotomize is the right word, but we tend to think in either or ways. And so an example of that for me would be like right now culturally, many of us are doing some personal work on bias, right? Many of us are doing extra reading. We're trying to understand sort of ways maybe that we make assumptions about people of another race without even realizing it, or maybe people who have different health habits or different appearances, or there's a whole list, right? And there's sort of a raising of awareness in our broader world right now, trying to learn about these things. And the thing that struck me as I looked through the lesson is how often we think in terms of seeing something and then immediately getting rid of it, So I think one example in the lesson was just encouraging us to really like stop and think about maybe groups of people or even individuals that you sort of have this visceral reaction to. You sort of label them automatically, or you make assumptions about them, or maybe you just, I mean, and we all do this, right? We judge a certain person, a certain appearance, a certain type of language as like sort of less human.
I suppose probably there's a variety of ways that we do this. Can you share something maybe about those different ways we do this actually?
I could maybe give an example. I mean, this comes out in all different manifestations, and now my mind is kind of racing as far as like how personal do I want to go, because a lot of these are very personal, right? And we don't want to maybe fully own the way that our brain automatically goes in a certain situation. But I guess one example that I am ready to own publicly would be coming from a background of a whole family, like a whole line of family members, not even just my immediate family, but a long line of family members that really put a lot of weight in appearance and even weight, right? So the assumption being that if I eat the right food, that I will be skinny and I will look a certain way, and therefore kind of extending that to other people, right? That if they would just eat the right food, right, they would look the way that I do. And this is a major problem. There's all kinds of research that we, like intellectually we know, right? It is not that simple, not that simple at all. But that's an example where we sort of can, like, I can recognize that in myself and try to stop myself when I notice that I'm going down that road. But the challenge that I saw in the lesson was there was this term, I want to make sure that I represent this right. So there was a question that said something to the effect of why do we have to, why must we change that attitude, right? Change that attitude. How can you make that change happen? And something that I've learned just through the broader cultural conversations right now, and also through this seminar where we're looking at theology and our brains and social science and all these things and how they intersect, like I'm just learning there's a sense in which I can be aware of that. I can be aware that my mind goes crazy places when I see someone, right, who doesn't look like I look. But I can't change that. I can't just wake up and say, God, change that. Like, make me not do that anymore. And then tomorrow, just, suddenly there are none of that is going on. That's simply not the way that we work. That we function by means of multiple signals that are going to our brain. They're called sort of bottom up, right? This is just the way things go, the signals, and then we respond to the signals, right? And this is all kind of below our conscious awareness. And so to me, it's been really helpful just to be aware of that, because it takes the pressure off. I don't have to say, oh, I am like a hopeless human being if I can't become aware of one of these biases or assumptions and then immediately root it out completely and be like a new person. And that is freeing in the sense that we can own it, right? And I can own how hurtful it is, how ill-informed it is. I can own all those things, but I don't have to at the same time say I am a horrible person and hopeless in the sense of human relating. No. At the same time, I can strive to sit down and hear people's stories who look different than me, right? Or who have a different sort of relationship with food than I might, right? And I can really sit and try to learn, but at the same time be aware of these kind of subconscious processes that are happening. It releases me from the pressure of trying to immediately reform and become different. And to me, that's been really helpful, because I feel like the either or is just not, it doesn't ring true in lived experience. And so learning about that has given me a way forward that's a little bit freeing and hopeful.
I really like that, because it seems to me like that's the challenge, that we face right now, is that we don't understand, we don't relate, and we have a hard time listening to other people's stories. And I think it's a two-way street, because it's almost to the point now that in society that, some people are allowed to share, but others can't share. But really it has to be a two-way street that takes place of how we recognize that, as you said so well, all of us, right? It doesn't matter who we are, what country we live in, our ethnicity, our gender. we all have these natural biases, right? That just who we are. But learning to listen and be aware of those really, I think, is the victory, right? Because then it allows a conversation to take place where real healing and understanding can take place. And I think really that all this stuff, that it doesn't work in a, how do I want to describe this? It's not like I can simply explain to you a list of reasons why we should, not be biased and how we should relate. But to me, transformation comes about in relationships. It's as we meet people who are not like us, we sit down with them, we accept them as God's children, equally loved by God, and we begin to know them. That's when I think real change can take place. And as we are exposed to more people and that opportunity takes place, I think then we can find real healing if we're willing to have those conversations. That's an if, right? Because many of us put up walls and we're afraid of those conversations. And I think we need those conversations. They have to take place. It has to take place on a two-way street. It kind of reminds me of a set of glasses. I remember when I first realized I needed glasses. This was after I graduated from college and went in for an eye test and got these glasses, and it was like, wow, I never recognized what I was missing. I mean, there was this detail that faces weren't always blurry, far away, but they could be clear. And I wonder, what do you think? Does that experience of putting on a new pair of glasses, does that give us maybe some ideas, or does it relate perhaps to our topic for this week's lesson?
Good question. I still remember the first time that I put on glasses. It was when I was a college student, so I blame reading and books for destroying my vision. But I put on glasses and so I remember I got them at Walmart, I think, and I remember going out from the Vision Center at Walmart and suddenly being like, wow, I didn't know there was all that framing up there, all these diagonal beams that are holding the building up, right? And then I walked outside and came back to campus and I saw what seemed like millions of leaves on a tree that I thought was just a painting in a book where you can see these blotches and you figure, well, that's the leaves, 1, 2, 3, maybe 10. And there were millions of them, and I remember that. And it does make me wonder. It makes me want to go back to Mark 8, and how it seems like there's a indication that many times in our human experience, perhaps we're arguing in this lesson that there's a process, right? And that everywhere on that process is legitimate and okay, and that God is carrying us along through that process, meaning that many times we might be seeing other people like trees walking, right? Or one other text that is very well known and that sort of puts this same idea but in different words is the love chapter from 1 Corinthians. You have Paul saying, now, we see through a glass darkly, is how I memorized it as a kid, and now as an archaeologist I have a new understanding of that, because if you dig up a mirror from 3,000 years ago, it's just horrible. It's nothing like a mirror, right? Where we look and we see a pretty close representation of ourselves. This is when he says glass darkly, he means a really bent and distorted and dirty piece of glass or metal that's shiny, right? That you try to see yourself in, you try to see, and this is our reality, that in much of this journey we are seeing dimly or darkly or partially, or we're on this process. And Paul kind of says, now we see through this glass or this mirror dimly, but then face to face, right? He says, now I know in part, then I shall know. And this is what ties back to your point about relational, the relational nature of human thriving and reality. Then I shall know just as I am known, right? So all along the way, so I was trying to think about that. don't think that the putting on of glasses for the first time is a great representation, because in a way it could give us unrealistic expectations. We might think, well, the instant I'm baptized, then suddenly I'm just going to see everything like God sees it, and everything's going to be new, and I'm going to love everyone. And then, you come up out of the water and life is, really appallingly the same in many ways. So I think it can, but at the same time, I think that the biblical writers, the reason many of these stories are recorded is because they did feel like their encounter with God was paradigm shifting. Like it did give them a new pair of glasses, and they saw themselves and the world and everything in a new way just immediately. And I think that many Christians, so I should speak for myself, but I don't think my experience is limited. Many of us have moments that have done that for us. So a moment where we did have this flash of understanding, where suddenly we saw ourselves or another person or a situation in a totally new way, and we experienced that as a gift from God, where He comes down and He's like, let me clean your glasses. Okay, here you go. Now you can see. So I guess it's a combination, and something we experience as a beautiful gift sometimes, and then other times I think we must be patient with ourselves and with God, because it doesn't seem like that instantaneous transformation is necessarily God's main priority.
Maybe it's the analogy might not be like a pair of glasses then. Maybe it's like the ever new iPhone that keeps coming out.
With a better and better camera?
Yeah, better and better camera, right? And some of us are still back in the iPhone 5.
Yeah.
We need to move on, right?
Hey, be careful there.
But I think that's really true. So, yeah, and I think certainly during...
And maybe it's the analogy might not be like a pair of glasses then. Maybe it's like the ever new iPhone that keeps coming out, right? You see this... Yeah, a better and better camera, right? And some of us are still back in the iPhone 5, and we need to move on, right, to whatever the newest one is. But I think that's really true. So, yeah, and I think certainly during the times that we live in today, that we need a clear understanding, and to be able to see others as God sees us, I think is beautiful. Dr. Washburn, our time really is up, and I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk about this week's chapter. I think it's, I really value your comments and perspectives. I think you've enriched our study today, so thank you for joining us. And I also want to thank our viewers for taking the time to also join us this week. I think that this lesson really comes at very much of a needed time. There's lots of frustration in society today, particularly with the ongoing coronavirus situation. It doesn't seem to be getting better, but worse. We find ourselves in a political year, right, an election year, so everything is politicalized, and we see, lines being drawn, anger, frustration, a lack of understanding. And if there ever really was a time when we needed to see people through the eyes of Jesus, I think it's today. And so I would pray, just as Paul prayed for the Ephesians 2,000 years ago, I'll end by praying that God may open our eyes of our hearts to be able to see others as He would have us see them. And so who is it that God wants you to see differently this week? Is it a spouse? Is it a child? Is it a colleague? Is it a friend, another family member? But may all of us respond to whatever that situation is and be able to allow God to touch our eyes again so we can see people as He sees them. Again, thank you for joining us for Theology Sabbath School. Take care, God bless, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.